had been driving for hours. The old highway stretched endlessly, cutting through thick forests and empty fields. The road was slick with rain, and my windshield wipers struggled to keep up. I was on my way to a cabin that my uncle had left behind when he passed away. It had been sitting empty for years, deep in the woods, far from any town. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, but I figured I could fix it up. Maybe sell it, or just use it as a quiet getaway. I had taken the back roads, wanting to avoid traffic, but now I was regretting it. The fuel gauge was getting low, and I hadn't seen a gas station in over an hour. The GPS had lost signal miles ago, and I was relying on an old paper map I had printed before leaving. The rain made it hard to see the road, and the trees pressed in on either side, their wet branches hanging low, almost brushing against my truck. When I finally saw the turnoff for the cabin, I almost missed it. A narrow dirt path, barely visible, led off into the trees. I slowed down, turning onto the road, my tires sinking slightly into the muddy ground. The forest swallowed me whole. The deeper I drove, the darker it got. The thick canopy overhead blocked out most of the light, and the rain made everything feel heavier, pressing down on me. The cabin appeared out of nowhere, sitting in a small clearing. It was exactly how I remembered it. Small, made of old dark wood, with a sagging porch and a rusted metal roof. The windows were dirty, the glass streaked from years of neglect. I parked the truck and stepped out. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. I grabbed my bag and walked up the steps. The porch creaked under my weight. When I reached for the door, I saw the lock was broken. That wasn't right. I had expected the place to be run down, but I didn't think anyone had been here in years. I pushed the door open, my other hand gripping the knife I always carried in my jacket pocket. Inside, the cabin was just how I remembered it. The small living area had a stone fireplace, a couch covered in an old sheet, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. The kitchen was barely more than a counter with a sink, a rusted-out stove, and a few cabinets. The bedroom was in the back, with a narrow bed against the wall. Everything smelled of dust, damp wood, and something else, something faint but sour. I set my bag down and checked the place over. The lock on the front door was broken, but nothing seemed disturbed. The furniture was still covered in dust, and there were no signs that anyone had been inside. I shook off the uneasy feeling and decided to get a fire going. I went outside to grab some wood from the old pile next to the cabin. The rain had let up slightly, turning into a light drizzle. I stacked the logs inside and lit a fire in the fireplace, watching as the flames slowly came to life. The warmth helped chase away the damp cold, but the unease in my gut didn't go away. As I moved through the cabin, checking the windows and making sure nothing was leaking, I noticed something odd. In the bedroom, on the floor near the bed, were footprints. Muddy footprints. They weren't mine. I froze, staring at them. They led from the window to the bed, then stopped. No prints leading away, just those few, as if someone had stood there, watching the bed, and then disappeared. I looked at the window. It was closed, but the lock was broken, just like the front door. My stomach twisted. Someone had been in here, maybe recently. I checked the closet, under the bed, behind the old curtains, nothing. The cabin was empty, but those footprints didn't make sense. I tried to shake it off. Maybe they were old. Maybe someone had squatted here years ago. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The rain outside had been falling all day. Those prints were fresh. Night fell fast. The fire crackled in the fireplace, and I sat on the couch, eating a cold can of beans. My truck was parked just outside, and I told myself if anything felt wrong, I could leave. But something about the cabin felt off. The sounds of the woods at night were familiar. Crickets, the wind moving through the trees, the occasional rustle of an animal. But every now and then, I'd hear something else. A creak like weight shifting on wood. A faint scuffing sound came from the back of the cabin, near the bedroom. I didn't move. I just sat there listening. The noise came again, slow, deliberate, like someone shifting their weight, trying not to be heard. I stood up, my pulse pounding. The knife was still in my pocket, and I pulled it out as I moved toward the bedroom. The The firelight barely reached that far, leaving the hallway in shadows. I stepped inside. The footprints were still there, but now there were more. They hadn't been there earlier. I turned fast, scanning the room, my breath tight in my chest. Nothing. Just the room, the old bed, the dusty floor. Then I saw the closet door. It was slightly open. I reached for it, my fingers trembling. I yanked it open in one quick motion, knife raised. Nothing. Just darkness. The closet was empty, filled with old clothes and dust. But as I stood there, I heard it. A single creak coming from the living room. I turned and rushed back out, my knife tight in my grip. The front door was open, wide open. The rain poured outside, washing away the footprints on the porch. My truck was still there, but the sight of that open door made my stomach drop. I had locked it. I was sure I had locked it. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring out into the dark woods beyond the clearing. I didn't see anyone, but I felt them, watching. I grabbed my keys off the table, shoved my bag over my shoulder, and walked straight to the truck. I didn't run. I didn't look around. I just got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the rain, lighting up the trees ahead. Nothing moved. I pressed down on the gas and pulled out, my tires slipping slightly in the mud. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw movement on the porch. A figure standing just inside the cabin, watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back again. I drove through the night, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I checked into a motel and sat awake until dawn, knife in my lap, every sound making my skin crawl. The next day, I called someone to board up the cabin. I never went back, and I never found out who had been in there with me that night. I was never afraid of being alone in the woods. Some people hated the silence, the isolation, the way the trees seemed to swallow up the world. But for me, it was peace. It was freedom. That was why I had spent every hunting season deep in the forests of northern Montana, in the same old cabin my father had used when I was a kid. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-room structure, a wood-burning stove, and a small porch that faced the valley below. It had a well out back, an outhouse about 20 yards away, and a shed where I kept some extra supplies. No electricity, no running water, no neighbors for miles. Just the forest, the mountains, and whatever I could carry in with me. This year, I had come out early in November, planning to stay a week. I wanted to bag a deer before the first real snowfall. The roads leading in were already rough, but I managed to get my truck as far as the base of the ridge. From there, I hiked the last 2 miles with my gear. It was cold, but not unbearable. I had done it a dozen times before. I spent the first 2 days scouting the area, following deer tracks along the valley, setting up a few game cameras. Felt good to be back. At night, I would sit on the porch, sip from a flask, and listen to the wind push through the trees. But on the 3rd day, I noticed something strange. I had woken up before dawn, planning to hike up the ridge where I had seen fresh tracks the day before. When I stepped outside, the first thing I saw was the ground. Footprints. Human footprints. They were faint, but clear enough in the frost-covered dirt. They led from the tree line toward my cabin, stopping about 10 feet from the porch before turning around and vanishing back into the woods. I stood there for a long time, just staring at them. The thing that unsettled me the most wasn't that someone had come near my cabin. It was the way the prints stopped. No hesitation, no circling the cabin, just a straight path to the edge of the clearing and back out. Like whoever it was had walked right up, stood there for a minute, then left. I told myself it was just a hunter, someone passing through, maybe checking to see if the cabin was occupied. But still, it stuck with me the whole day. That evening, as I sat on the porch cleaning my rifle, I kept glancing at the tree line. The sun had dipped below the ridge, and the temperature was dropping fast. The forest had that heavy stillness that only comes in deep winter. Then I heard it, a single crack somewhere up the slope, like a branch snapping underfoot. I tensed, holding my breath, listening. Another crack, then nothing, just silence. I stood up, rifle in hand, scanning the trees. It was getting too dark to see much, but I swore I saw movement, a slow, deliberate shift of shadow between the trunks. I stayed out there for nearly an hour, watching, listening, but nothing else happened. No more sounds, no more movement. That night, I locked the cabin door. The next morning, I checked the clearing again. More footprints. This time, they came even closer, almost to the porch. I stared at them, heart hammering. They were fresh. Sometime during the night, someone had walked right up to my cabin. I followed them as far as I could before they disappeared into the undergrowth. No sign of a campsite, no sign of fire, discarded gear, nothing. I thought about packing up, leaving early, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I had a rifle, plenty of ammo, and enough experience in the woods to handle myself. If someone was creeping around, I'd find out who. That day, I barely left the cabin. I stayed close, checking my game cameras, walking the perimeter, trying to see if there were any more tracks leading in a different direction. Just before dusk, I took my rifle and hiked up the ridge, hoping to spot something from higher ground. The valley stretched out below, dark and empty. Nothing moved. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw it. Near the tree line, almost at the very edge of the clearing around my cabin, movement. A figure. I dropped into a crouch, raising my scope. It was a man, standing just inside the trees, half hidden by the branches. He wasn't wearing hunting gear, just dark clothes, maybe a jacket. No rifle, no backpack. He was just standing there, watching my cabin. A chill went through me. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just watched him. Then, as if he knew I was looking, he turned and walked back into the woods. Not in a hurry, just slow, casual steps until he disappeared into the trees. I stayed up on that ridge until the last bit of light was gone. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door and bolted it shut. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, rifle across my lap, listening. Sometime past midnight, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I held my breath, my finger resting on the trigger. My truck was miles away. If something happened, I was on my own. Then the doorknob rattled. I nearly fired right then, but I forced myself to wait. Whoever it was, they didn't try to break in. They just tested the door. Then silence. I sat there for hours, waiting for morning. When the first light crept through the trees, I opened the door. The footprints were there, right up against the cabin. But this time, there was something else. A single knife, stabbed into the wood of my porch railing. No note, no message, just the knife. I didn't pack. I didn't waste time. I grabbed what I could and started the hike back to my truck. When I got there, I checked the tires, the engine, nothing had been touched. But as I climbed in and slammed the door shut, I saw something in the rearview mirror. Up on the ridge, half hidden in the trees, was a figure, watching. I drove out of there and never went back. I don't know who it was. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. They weren't just passing through. They were waiting for what I never wanted to find out. I never wanted to take the job. It was late October when I got the call from a friend of a friend. A groundskeeper for an old cemetery on the outskirts of town had quit suddenly. The cemetery belonged to a small, nearly forgotten church, and with winter coming, they needed someone to stay on site and keep an eye on things. Mostly to stop people from breaking in or messing around. It wasn't the kind of job anyone wanted, but I needed the money. It was temporary, only a few weeks until they found someone permanent. The pay wasn't bad, and they offered a place to stay. That was the part that made me hesitate. The place to stay was a small wooden cabin sitting just beyond the rows of headstones, barely on the edge of the property. The thought of living right next to a cemetery for weeks wasn't something I liked, but I figured I'd be inside most of the time. I could deal with it. When I arrived, the place looked even worse than I expected. The cemetery was old, the kind of place that didn't get visitors anymore. Some of the headstones were tilting, the names worn away by decades of rain and wind. The church that owned it was a mile down the road, and no one was around. It felt isolated, cut off. The dirt road leading in was cracked and uneven, as if no one had driven down it in years. The cabin was even worse. It sat near the tree line, about 50 yards from the first row of graves. It wasn't big, just a one-room structure with a bed, a small kitchen area, and an old oil heater that looked like it hadn't worked in decades. There was no electricity, just a generator outside that ran on diesel. The last guy had left behind a few half-empty gas cans. I had brought my own just in case. I unloaded my things and tried to settle in. The place smelled damp, like old wood and mildew. The windows had no curtains, just open glass staring out toward the cemetery. I had an old battery-powered lantern, which I kept close as the sun started to go down. The heater barely worked, but I had enough blankets to get through the night. First, it wasn't bad. It was cold, quiet, too quiet. I wasn't used to the kind of silence that settled in after dark. No distant traffic, no voices, nothing but the occasional sound of wind through the trees. The graves sat there in the moonlight, pale stone markers stretching out in uneven rows. The first couple of nights, I barely slept. Every little sound made me sit up and listen. The wind in the trees, the creaking of the wooden cabin walls as they shifted in the cold. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling never really went away. Then things got worse. The first real sign that something was off happened on the fourth night. I had been walking the perimeter of the cemetery, checking for any signs of trespassers. The job wasn't just about keeping people out, it was about making sure no animals got in, that nothing was disturbed. I had a flashlight with me, the kind with a long beam, and as I swept it across the gravestones, something caught my eye. A single headstone off near the tree line had been pushed over. It wasn't cracked or broken, just lying flat on the ground, as if someone had knocked it over. It hadn't been like that the day before. I walked over, shining my light around, looking for footprints or anything else that might explain it. Nothing. The dirt around it was undisturbed, as if it had just fallen over on its own. I tried to set it back up, but the thing was heavy, too heavy for me to lift alone. I made a note to tell the church about it in the morning and went back inside the cabin. That night, I barely slept. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something. Not the wind, not the creaking of the cabin. Something outside. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone was walking through the cemetery, pausing, then moving again. I told myself it was just my imagination. Then, just before dawn, I heard something else. A scraping sound, right outside the cabin wall. I shot up, heart pounding, and grabbed my flashlight. I flicked it on and aimed it at the window. Nothing, just the cemetery, still and quiet under the early morning sky. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard it again, closer. I forced myself to get up, to go to the door. My hand hesitated on the handle, but I yanked it open and shined my light outside. Nothing. But there, in the dirt just a few feet from my cabin, were fresh marks. Scratches in the ground, like someone had dragged something heavy through the dirt. The marks led toward the cemetery. I didn't follow them. By the time the sun came up, the marks were gone. The wind had wiped them away. I spent the morning checking the graves, but everything looked normal, except for the headstone that had been knocked over. It was back in place. I told myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. The nights got worse. Every evening, just after dark, I'd start to hear things. Sometimes it was footsteps in the cemetery. Sometimes it was the sound of something brushing against the cabin walls. The worst part was that it never seemed random. Whatever it was, it moved with purpose. One night, I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not mine. It was coming from outside, just beneath my window. Slow, steady. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to even turn my head. The breathing went on for what felt like hours, then just stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The last night I spent in that cabin was the worst. I had been running the generator less and less, trying to save fuel. That meant longer hours in the dark, just me and my flashlight. That night, the wind was bad. It howled through the trees, making the whole cabin shudder. I lay in bed, waiting for sleep that never came. Then, just past midnight, I heard the door handle rattle. Slow at first, then harder. I bolted upright, heart slamming against my ribs. The lock held, but something was trying to get in. I reached for my flashlight, hand shaking, and aimed it at the door. The rattling stopped. Then, a single knock, soft, almost polite. I didn't move. Another knock, then silence. I sat there for what felt like forever, barely breathing. The wind outside had stopped. The whole world felt like it was holding its breath. Then, scratching. Long, slow scratches along the wooden door. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag, my flashlight, and my keys, and I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. The engine roared to life, and I tore down that dirt road, not looking back. I never went back. I called the church the next day and told them I quit. They didn't argue. I didn't ask if they had found anyone else. I didn't care. A few months later, I heard the cemetery was abandoned. No one took the job after me. The church eventually shut down. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear that slow, steady scratching at my door. It was 2016, and I was 32 when I took the job. It wasn't a dream opportunity, just something to keep me going after I'd left my previous work on bad terms. My boss, an older man named Richard, owned a series of hunting cabins scattered throughout the Scottish Highlands. He rented them out to hunters and tourists, but most of them were in rough condition, falling apart from years of neglect. My job was to live in one of these cabins for a few weeks, fixing it up enough so it could be rented again. The location was remote, far more than I expected. I took a train up from Manchester, then had to rent a truck just to drive the last stretch of the journey. There were no main roads leading up to the property, just dirt tracks cutting through endless miles of wilderness. It felt empty, unsettling in a way I couldn't put into words. When I arrived, I could see why the cabin needed repairs. The wood was weathered and cracked, the roof sagged in places, and the front door barely hung on its hinges. Inside, it was musty with old furniture covered in dust. There were 2 rooms, a small bedroom with a rickety bed and a main living area with a stone fireplace, a table, and a couple of chairs. No electricity, no running water, just a gas stove and a backup generator that barely worked. I unloaded my supplies, food, tools, and a rifle that Richard had left for me, just in case. I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but I assumed it was for animals. There were stories about wild boars in the area, and I wasn't about to take chances. The first few days were uneventful. I worked during daylight, replacing broken planks, clearing out debris, and sealing gaps in the walls. The nights, though, were unnerving. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the wind through the trees or the occasional sound of something moving outside. I told myself it was just wildlife, but every so often, I'd hear something strange, like footsteps. Not heavy, not obvious, just a soft crunching sound in the underbrush that always stopped the moment I paid attention. On the 5th night, I woke to a sound I couldn't ignore. It was past midnight, and I had been in a restless sleep when something outside snapped me awake. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, a deliberate creak of wood, like weight shifting on the porch. I sat up, listening. The rifle was by my bed, and I reached for it instinctively. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer? A boar? Maybe even a person? There weren't any nearby houses or roads, and I hadn't seen another human since I arrived. The idea that someone might be outside unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. Minutes passed. The creaking stopped. I stayed awake until dawn, too wired to sleep. When daylight finally came, I forced myself outside. The air was crisp, cold despite it being early autumn. I checked around the cabin, expecting to see animal tracks, But what I found made my stomach drop. Footprints. Human footprints circling the cabin. The ground was damp from rain the night before, so the prints were fresh, recent enough that they hadn't been disturbed. Someone had walked around the cabin in the night, stopping just outside my door. I followed the tracks a few meters before they disappeared into the woods. I had two options: pack up and leave, or stay and pretend it didn't happen. The logical thing was to go, but I had spent too much money and time getting here. Besides, I convinced myself that maybe it was just a lost hiker. The highlands were vast, and people sometimes wandered too far from trails. I stayed. The next few days, I was more cautious. I kept the rifle loaded and near me at all times. I set up makeshift alarms, strings with empty cans hanging from the porch. If someone tried sneaking up, I'd hear them. For a while, nothing happened. Then, on the 10th night, I woke up again. This time, it was different. I smelled something, a strong, foul odor, like rotting meat, wafted through the cabin. It was so pungent, it made my eyes water. I sat up, heart pounding. The smell wasn't there when I'd gone to sleep, and it wasn't coming from inside. I hesitated, then grabbed the rifle and my flashlight. My hands felt clammy as I stepped onto the porch. The air was thick with the stench, and the moment I turned the light towards the trees, I saw it. Carcass, a deer, gutted and strung up by its hind legs from a low tree branch. Its belly had been sliced open, entrails spilling onto the ground in a wet heap. The blood was still fresh, glistening in the flashlight's beam. But that wasn't the worst part. Someone had carved something into its side, a message crudely etched into the flesh. "Leave." My body locked up. The wind stirred the trees, and for a second, I swore I heard breathing nearby. Slow, deliberate. I turned off the flashlight, stood there, frozen, rifle gripped so tightly my fingers ached. I wanted to run back inside, but I knew if someone was out there, they could be watching me, waiting. I backed up slowly, step by step, until I reached the door, slipped inside, locked it. The rest of the night was a blur. I sat in the dark, listening, waiting. The smell of the carcass lingered, but nothing else happened. Morning came and I made my decision. I was leaving. No job was worth this. I packed my things in under an hour. I didn't bother checking outside until I was ready to go. When I finally did, the deer carcass was gone. Only a dark stain remained on the ground. The footprints were back too. More of them this time. They led from the trees to the cabin and then away again, as if whoever had been watching me wanted me to know they were close, that they could have come inside if they wanted to. I didn't waste another second. I got in the truck, started the engine, and didn't look back. I drove until I hit the main road, then kept going, straight to the nearest town. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I just found a motel, locked the door, and tried to forget. Weeks later, Richard called, wondering why I'd left without notice. I lied and told him I had an emergency. He didn't seem too bothered, just asked if I'd at least managed to get some of the work done. I never told him the real reason I left. Never told anyone. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those footprints, about the deer carcass and the message carved into its side. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. It had been almost 2 years since my wife passed away. 2 years of trying to keep myself busy, drowning in work, and avoiding the places that held memories too painful to face. The cabin was one of those places. We had bought it together 10 years ago, deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It was meant to be our getaway, a quiet escape from the city where we could fish in the lake, sit by the fire, and just be away from everything. But after she died, I stopped going. I couldn't even drive past the road that led to it. Until last week. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe I was tired of running from it. Maybe I thought I was finally strong enough. Or maybe, deep down, I just needed to see if the place still existed without her in it. So I packed a bag, threw it in the back of my truck, and drove north. The roads were familiar but different. The small towns along the way looked a little more run down than I remembered, and the gas stations were even emptier than before. It felt like I was driving into a past that no longer existed. By the time I turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky. The trees on either side of the road were tall and dark, their bare branches stretching overhead like a tunnel. The cabin sat at the end of the road, just past a clearing. It looked the same. The wooden porch, the slanted roof, the chimney that hadn't seen smoke in years. The driveway was covered in leaves, untouched by tire tracks. I parked and sat in the truck for a while, staring at it, feeling that deep, heavy weight settle in my chest. Eventually, I forced myself to get out. The air was cold, sharper than I expected for early October. I grabbed my bag from the truck bed and walked up the steps. The porch creaked under my weight. The front door was locked, just the way I had left it. I fumbled with the keys, my hands stiff from the cold, and finally got the door open. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood. The last time I had been here, she was still alive. Everything was as we left it. The blankets were still folded over the couch. Her books were still stacked on the side table. Even the old coffee mug she used to drink from was sitting in the sink. I had told myself I wouldn't get emotional, but I did. I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself. I had planned to clean up a little, maybe air the place out, but instead, I just sat on the couch, staring at nothing. As the hours passed, the cabin grew darker. I lit the old oil lamp on the table and turned on the propane heater. The night outside was completely silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, just dead, heavy quiet. Then something shifted. It wasn't a noise exactly, more like a feeling, that eerie sensation that someone is watching you. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The cabin had always felt different at night, even when she was here. I got up and checked the windows. Nothing, just the black outline of trees against the night sky. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. The bed felt wrong without her in it. So I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. Then I heard something, a soft crunching sound outside, like footsteps on dried leaves. I held my breath. Maybe it was an animal, a deer, a coyote. They wandered through these woods all the time. But then it came again, closer this time. I sat up, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. The porch creaked. I wasn't alone. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, clicking it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, shaking slightly in my unsteady grip. Another creak. Someone was standing on the porch. I moved slowly, stepping out of bed, careful not to make a sound. The wooden floor was cold under my feet. I grabbed the rifle from the corner of the room, the one I always kept at the cabin for hunting. I made my way toward the front window, crouching low. The porch light was off, but the moon cast just enough light for me to see a dark shape standing by the door. Not an animal, a man. I couldn't make out his face, just the outline of his body, tall and still. He wasn't moving, just standing there, listening. I gripped the rifle tighter, my mind racing. I had left my truck parked out front. He knew someone was here. Another creak. This time, it came from the side of the cabin. There were two of them. A second shadow moved along the wall, just past the window. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. I had to be smart. I had to get out of there. I moved back toward the bedroom, keeping low, trying to stay in the shadows. My truck keys were in my bag by the couch. If I could get to them, I could make a run for it. Another creak. The doorknob rattled. They were trying to get in. I grabbed my bag, pulling the zipper as quietly as I could. The keys jingled softly, too loud. A louder noise came from the back of the cabin. A sharp, splintering crack. They were breaking in. I had no choice. I bolted for the front door, throwing it open and raising the rifle. The man on the porch was closer now, his face just a blur of shadow and pale skin. I didn't wait. I fired. The gunshot shattered the silence, echoing through the trees. The man didn't scream. He just stumbled back, vanishing into the darkness. I didn't wait to see where he went. I ran. I sprinted to my truck, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking. The engine roared to life. In the rearview mirror, I saw movement, dark shapes slipping between the trees. I slammed my foot on the gas, tearing down the dirt road. I didn't stop. Not until I hit the highway, not until the cabin was miles behind me. I never went back. I don't know who they were. I don't want to know. The cabin still stands, I assume. Abandoned now, lost in the woods, just a place I used to know. A place that once held love, then grief, and now something else. I haven't told anyone about that night. I don't think I ever will. It had been raining for 3 days straight. Not the kind of light drizzle that makes the air feel fresh, but a constant, heavy downpour that soaked through my clothes no matter how many layers I wore. The wind didn't help either. It pushed the rain sideways, made the trees groan, and carried a bitter chill that got into my bones. I was out in the middle of nowhere, working on a half-finished cabin that belonged to a man I barely knew. My boss had taken the job, a full cabin build in a remote part of the woods, and since I was the youngest guy on the crew, I was the one sent out for the night shift. Just do some finishing work, my boss had said. Secure the beams, check the roofing, tighten up anything loose. Easy stuff, according to him. But standing there, in the cold rain, the wind howling through the trees, it didn't feel easy. The cabin was just a frame at this point. Wooden beams forming the skeleton, half a roof overhead, and only a few walls up. It wasn't much shelter from the rain. My truck was parked about 50 feet away, on a strip of dirt that was quickly turning to mud. The headlights were on, shining through the rain like two dull eyes, barely helping. I had a portable work light set up near the structure, but the wind made the shadows shift constantly, like something was moving just beyond my sight. I didn't like this place. It wasn't fear, not exactly. Just that uncomfortable feeling you get when something is off. Too quiet, too dark, too empty. The rain should have made noise as it hit the ground. The wood, the leaves, but it all felt muffled, like the forest was swallowing the sound. I grabbed my tool belt and got to work, starting with the roof beams. The wind made them creak above me, and I kept glancing up, half expecting one to snap loose. The last thing I needed was to get crushed by a falling log in the middle of nowhere. The hours dragged. The cold got worse. My fingers felt stiff, even in gloves. Every now and then I stopped to listen. Not because I wanted to, because I felt like I had to. It was that deep, gnawing sense that I wasn't alone out there. A branch cracked somewhere behind me. I turned fast, heart thudding, but saw nothing. Just trees, rain, and darkness. My truck's headlights barely reached the edge of the clearing, and beyond that, it was black. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe. Could have been anything. But I still felt that heavy, crawling sensation on my skin, like I was being watched. I forced myself to keep working. A while later, I moved to the side of the cabin where I had stacked some lumber earlier. The ground was a mess. Mud, wet leaves, pools of water. I reached down, grabbed a plank, and then I saw it. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, deep in the mud, leading from the trees toward the cabin. I froze. My breath came sharp and fast. The prints were large, heavier than mine, and spaced like someone had been moving slow. Watching, I looked around, my mind racing. The rain had covered most of the sounds, but I was sure I hadn't heard anyone approach. And there was no reason for someone else to be out here. I pulled my flashlight from my belt and pointed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I saw were wet trunks and tangled branches. Nothing moved. I waited, staring into the woods, every muscle tight. The rain dripped from the trees. The wind sighed. Then, from somewhere deeper in the forest, something shifted. A figure. I barely saw it. Just the slightest movement, a dark shape blending into the trees. No details, no face, just the sense that someone was standing there. Watching me, I stood frozen, gripping the flashlight so tight my fingers ached. I couldn't see them clearly, but I knew they were there. Slowly, I reached down, picked up the hammer from my belt and stepped back toward the cabin. The work light flickered as the wind shook it, casting wild shadows across the half-built walls. I turned, scanning the trees again, but the figure was gone. I felt trapped. The truck was 50 feet away, across open ground. The trees surrounded me on all sides. If I ran, would they chase me? If I stayed, would they come closer? I took another step back. The mud sucked at my boots. My breathing felt too loud. Then I heard it. Not a voice, not words, just a low, slow breath. In. Close. Too close. I spun, shining the flashlight wildly, expecting to see someone right behind me. Nothing. The footprints were still there. The trees still swayed. The wind still howled. But I wasn't alone. I turned and walked, fast and steady, toward my truck. I kept my eyes ahead, but I could feel something at my back. Not chasing, not running, just following. I reached the truck, yanked the door open, and jumped in, locking it behind me. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the keys. The headlights cut across the clearing as I turned the engine over. For a second, everything looked normal. Just a work site in the rain, piles of lumber, tools scattered where I'd left them. And then, just at the edge of the light, half hidden by the trees, I saw him. A man, tall, still, watching. I didn't think. I just hit the gas. Mud sprayed as the tires fought for grip. Then I was moving, headlights bouncing, trees blurring past. I didn't stop. Not until I was miles away. Back on the main road, heart still hammering, rain still pounding against the windshield. I never told my boss what I saw. Just made an excuse, said the storm was too rough to work in. A few weeks later, someone else finished the cabin. I never went back. And sometimes, when it's raining, I think about those footprints in the mud, about the figure standing in the trees, about the breath too close in the dark. And I wonder how long he'd been watching me before I noticed. I needed a break. Work had been relentless for the past few months, and I felt drained, like I was running on fumes. I wanted to go somewhere quiet, far from the noise of the city, somewhere I could be alone with my thoughts. That's how I ended up in France, renting a small cabin in the woods. It wasn't a fancy vacation spot, just a simple place in the countryside, far enough from any major town that I wouldn't have to deal with crowds or distractions. That was the whole point. The cabin belonged to an older man named Jacques, who lived in a farmhouse a few miles down the road. He rented it out to people looking for solitude, hunters, or the occasional traveler who didn't mind roughing it. It wasn't a luxurious place by any means, just a single-story wooden structure with basic furniture, a wood stove, and no electricity. I had to use gas lamps at night and rely on a small generator if I wanted power. But I didn't mind. That was exactly what I was looking for. The first few days were peaceful. The air was crisp, the forest stretched out in all directions, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I spent most of my time reading, hiking, and chopping firewood to keep the cabin warm at night. It was perfect. But then, on the fourth night, something changed. I had finished eating a simple meal and was sitting on the porch, listening to the distant hoot of an owl. The sky was dark, the stars bright, and the forest was silent except for the occasional chirp of insects. That's when I saw him. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. He was standing just beyond the tree line, maybe 50 meters away, barely visible in the dim light. A tall figure, motionless, just standing there, watching. I stared for a long time, expecting him to move, to reveal himself as just another traveler or a local hunter passing through. But he didn't. He just stood there. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a lost hiker, maybe a farmer from a nearby village, maybe even Jacques checking in on the cabin. But something felt wrong. The way he stood there, perfectly still, facing me without making a sound. It made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the tree line. The moment the beam landed on him, he stepped back, vanishing into the trees like a shadow. I couldn't see his face, just the shape of him disappearing into the darkness. A strange feeling settled over me. My instincts told me to lock the door and stay inside. It wasn't that I was afraid of one man, but the way he had just stood there, silently watching me, didn't sit right. I went inside, locked the door, and sat in the chair by the window. I kept the flashlight in my hand, listening. But the forest was silent again, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe I had been staring too long at the darkness and convinced myself there was someone there. But I couldn't shake the unease. I walked to the spot where I had seen him. The ground was covered in leaves, twigs, and patches of damp earth. I looked for footprints, but the forest floor was too uneven to tell if anyone had been there. Still, I felt watched. That night, I kept my lantern on longer than usual. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees outside, making every shadow stretch and twist. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but then around midnight I heard it. Footsteps, not the light, quick steps of an animal. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from the woods. I turned off the lantern, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the cabin. I barely breathed, then silence. Whoever it was, they were standing outside. I moved as quietly as I could to the window and peeked through the gap in the curtain. In the moonlight, I saw him again, standing just a few meters from my porch. Closer this time. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the cabin. A shiver ran down my spine. I wanted to shout, to scare him off, but something about the way he stood there, unmoving, made my throat dry up. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, he turned and walked back into the woods. No rush, no panic, just walked away, disappearing into the trees like before. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went to Jacques' farmhouse. I told him what had happened, expecting him to dismiss it, but his expression darkened. He was silent for a long time, then finally muttered something about staying inside at night and keeping my doors locked. That wasn't comforting. I thought about leaving, but I had paid for another week, and I didn't want to seem paranoid. I convinced myself it was just a local messing around, maybe some guy trying to scare me for fun. That night, I locked everything. I kept my lantern burning, but every noise outside made my skin crawl. I didn't see him again that night, but I barely slept. The next day, I went into the woods. Not far, just to see if there were any signs of him. That's when I found the cabin. It was deep in the trees, hidden between thick branches and undergrowth. An old, rotting structure barely standing. The door was missing, and the inside was empty except for an old mattress and piles of leaves where animals had nested. But someone had been there recently. The ground was disturbed. Footprints, a pile of ashes from an old fire. Then I saw something that made my stomach twist. A set of clothes folded neatly on the mattress. A shirt, pants, a jacket, all covered in dried mud. The same clothes the man had been wearing. I left immediately. That night, I sat in the cabin, gripping my flashlight, waiting. I knew he was still out there, watching. I didn't sleep. I waited until sunrise, packed my things, and left. I never saw him again. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, standing somewhere in those woods, watching the empty cabin, waiting for the next person to come looking for solitude. Waiting,